We're going to go over the focus search pattern for appendicitis complicated by abscess. And it's important to realize that for this type of a case, there are a few different scenarios that you may see this. It may happen in the acute setting where you have an acute appendicitis and maybe there's like a contained perforation at the base with an abscess, or there's an abscess upon initial presentation. But also you can have scenarios where you have a known prior perforated appendicitis and the patient represents with an infection type picture, and you get the scan and you see the prior complications of perforation and then an organized fluid collection or abscess. a little bit So it's a little bit variable. Regardless of how you kind of come to it, though, your search pattern is going to be pretty similar and is going to build upon what we've discussed previously for things like acute appendicitis or appendicitis with perforation. So again, we have our axial, we have our coronal here. I'm going to scroll down. It is important to realize that for these types of cases, it is sometimes really tough to find the terminal ileum and the ileocecal valve. It can be a little bit of a mess. And in this particular case, this was a chronic perforation or a prior perforation that's representing. So there are pretty advanced inflammatory changes in the right lower quadrant. But because I've looked at this case extensively before, I feel pretty confident that the small bowel comes in like this and that the terminal ileum is probably here and it plugs into the cecum somewhere around here. I don't necessarily see the fatty ileocecal valve, but the terminal ileum connects to the cecum somewhere around here. And then if we scroll down, we see more cecum. And then as we scroll, again, this is a prior perforation, but as we scroll, we see that the appendix comes off somewhere around here, and then we can follow it. It's very irregular, and the blind end is somewhere around here. So we'll look on the coronal here. It takes a really interesting course. But here's the blind end of the appendix, and then as we scroll back and forth, we see this in plane here. It does connect to the cecum, but because this was a prior perforated appendicitis, there are areas that are not really enhancing, and there is evidence of that prior perforation. So it's not the cleanest tracking it back to the base, and its base here, it's not the most distinct. So it may have perforated at the base, and there's a lot going on there. Now, okay, so we feel pretty good that that is the appendix, and we can kind of trace it back up here. And then what we have to do now is look for things like an organized fluid collection. And it's not that subtle here, but if we look here, we see that there is a fluid and air-filled collection here. And if we scroll back and forth, we look on the coronal, we see that this is not connected to any, it's not the lumen of bowel, although at a glance it can be a little misleading, but this is actually a fluid collection in between bowel loops. That's probably a complication from the prior perforation. So, oftentimes it can be near the appendix. It doesn't necessarily need to be, depending on the extent of spillage. So you do want to look on your soft tissue windows, look on your axial and coronal, and see, are there any other fluid collections? This really seems to be the major one. And then what you want to do is look on your coronal as well too, and just look for other things that look suspicious, like this collection right here. And then of course, you can go to your lung windows and look for free air, just like we always do with appendicitis, just looking for evidence of perforation. In this case, we knew there was a prior perforation, but still, it's helpful to find the air that's in the fluid collection and just look if there's any obvious pneumoperitoneum or anything like that. It just seems like it's just in the abscess here. But in the end, what we have is our appendicitis that was previously perforated with extensive inflammatory changes, and then we look for that free air, those fluid collection, and we see that we have an abscess right here centrally. And then, a lot of the times you want to kind of decide, or kind of make note of, maybe not so much in the report, but just be prepared to have the discussion. Is this something that's accessible by percutaneous biopsy or not? Oftentimes, whoever's going to be doing the percutaneous drainage is going to be the one who's going to make the decision. But this, for example, is surrounded by a ton of bowel, a lot of vascular structures. Doesn't really seem like there's a great percutaneous window to access this because it's so central. But that is probably the next step to think about. It's stylistic. It may depend on where you're at. You may put it in the report if it's really obvious, but ultimately it usually makes sense to defer to whoever is going to potentially be doing the percutaneous drainage for them to make the decision if they believe it's safe or not. You don't want to decide for another provider what kind of procedure they should be doing. But that's our focus search pattern.